panel. I'm Hong Zhichang, or you can call me Jessica. Today we are very happy we have 5 speakers talking about cord blood banks in different perspectives. We have people in law, ethics, and more sociology, and different backgrounds. And also we talk about cord blood banks in different countries like China and Japan, UK, in different contexts. And so first we will welcome Sarah Chang, Dr. Sarah Chang. She is the Deputy Director at the Institute of Science, Ethics and Innovation in the University of Manchester. And her research has focused on social and ethical implication of emerging biotechnologies and the role of this science and innovation in society. So we will welcome her.
Thanks very much, and thank you for the invitation to be here. I'm sorry I wasn't able to join you yesterday. I had another speaking engagement that I was at, but I'm very pleased to be here now. What I would like to sketch out today is a way of thinking about stem cell banking, cord blood banking in particular, but about stem cell banking that treats the biomaterials in question and the products of the bank as a public benefit, and what follows from that in terms of the moral arguments around how we carry out biobanking, stem cell banking. Some of the issues I'm going to talk about are more specific to cord blood banking. Others of them apply to stem cell banks in general, and indeed biomaterials and the use of biomaterials in a banking context. So what do we mean when we talk about a cord blood bank? I think it's fairly clear that in the context we're concerned about, we're not actually talking about the type of banks that simply provide individual storage of a sample. Why not? Well, firstly, because there's limited usefulness to this form of banking. As we know, any given individual is unlikely in the course of her lifetime to need her own particular sample. So cord blood banks that provide solely individual storage are a waste of personal resources. In the early days of cord blood banking, there was quite a bit of criticism about private companies launching banks which would offer to take people's cells, store them, and then make them available if your child ever needed them. And it was seen that this was, in most cases, a waste of the person's own resources and a way for the companies more or less just to make money. So it's a waste of personal resources. But it's also a waste of a potentially valuable biological resource, the cord blood sample itself. So this is a resource that could be used. It may be used for therapeutic autologous transplantation, but as we've said, the chances that any given individual is going to need that in their lifetime are still pretty low. So if we restrict the use of the sample to sole private use, it's unlikely to be actually of any benefit to anyone. On the other hand, we might be able to use it therapeutically for other patients, and we might be able to use it in research. So this being the case, there are good moral reasons to use cord blood, not just in an individual storage sense, but to have a broader use of the blood that's banked. So there's a similarity here to the sorts of arguments made about embryonic stem cells, the nothing is lost argument, the waste avoidance. Cord blood is a potentially useful resource. The uses in treatment research create value, and therefore there's a reason for us to try and put it to use. Okay, so the more conventional idea of a biobank, rather than a place that just takes your sample, holds it, and gives it back to you if you need it, the more conventional idea involves some sort of sharing of the value between the progenitor and the bank. If you think about it, this is actually not so dissimilar to a financial bank. So when you put your money in the bank, although the resource remains exclusively yours, the bank uses your money to invest and make more money, and then you benefit out of that. So this idea about they hold your resource but then use it to generate value isn't so dissimilar. But in the case of cord blood banking, questions arise about what that distribution of value amongst the depositors, if you like, should be. We've already concluded that a system that preserves the resource exclusively for the progenitor's own use is not ideal. So how should that value be shared out between the bank and its members, and perhaps people outside the bank? If we think for a moment almost to the other extreme, many research biobanks often entail the progenitor giving up almost all rights in their sample. So they may retain the right to withdraw, to say, I no longer want my biomaterial to be used in your biobank. Even that is a matter for ethical debate. So much is made in the ethics of biobanking about the limits of consent, whether people ought to be able to withdraw consent years later to a sample that's been stored. And of course the benefit of having tissue archives for research provides us with a prima facie reason to say actually there is a good of retaining the sample. We'll talk a little bit more about withdrawing and consent later on. But in research biobanking, there may be the right to withdraw, but there are generally few other rights. So you don't necessarily have the right to kind of take that sample out and use it. The difference with cord blood, of course, is that the sample in question remains potentially useful to the person who has donated it. So it's potentially therapeutically useful to the progenitor. When we start talking about what rights cord blood progenitors should retain, over their sample itself, over, say, cell lines that might be produced from the sample, over other sorts of derivatives, and, of course, whether there should be any right to profit. We enter a territory that overlaps with the uses of other biomaterials to produce commercially or scientifically valuable derivatives. I think most of you will be familiar both with the story of HeLa cells and the John Moore case. Yeah. I'm seeing a lot of nodding. Yeah, good. So the lesson that I take away from these two cases are often used to talk about individual rights and to question how much right should people have over their cells and tissues once those cells and tissues have been scientifically used and modified, and something of value, in this case cell lines both, have been generated out of it. So the HeLa cell line wasn't patented but was of great scientific value and led to other commercially valuable products. And people often say in relation to this that this represents gross unfairness and it was unethical, both because the progenitor didn't consent to the cell line, but also because she and her family received none of the benefits and didn't know this was being done. In the Moore case, of course, John Moore found out that his cell line was being used his cells were being used in this way. The cell line was patented, the scientists were making a profit, and again, they hadn't told him that they were doing this. Now, I don't think these cases are just about consent. The concern in these cases isn't going to be addressed if we had said, well, let's find Henrietta Lacks's family and just pay them to say, okay, here's some consideration for the vastly useful scientific tool that's come out of this. Similarly, although Moore was particularly incensed about the idea that scientists were profiting from what he calls his genetic essence, I don't think our concern would be addressed. His might have been, but I don't think ours would be addressed simply if the scientists had then gone, here you go, have a share of the profits from our patent. We're going to continue to make money in this way, but you can have some of it. So the concern isn't actually just about consent and individual rights to the cells. I would say that the concern is more to do with how we expect science to use patient materials to generate benefits and how we expect those benefits to be distributed. So, as I said, I don't think it would have addressed our concerns in those two cases had there been some form of payment or reciprocity or benefit sharing of the good that came out of the cell lines. In a similar way, I think participation in cord blood banking need not entail strict reciprocity of benefits. So I think we're past the era of thinking that justice means an eye for an eye. Imagine a situation where a number of people contribute samples to the bank. One person's sample turns out to be scientifically valuable or commercially exploitable or therapeutically useful. Do we think that that person is the only member who should then receive a share of the benefits? I think the answer there is clearly no. So it's not just an individual sharing of the benefit that's come out. Another way of looking at it is to say just because you are lucky enough to have been the one who provided the sample that led to the useful discovery, why does that mean you should benefit while others who contributed but were less lucky should not? So thinking about this, I think gives us some insight into the ways in which we might want a cord blood bank to be run, particularly about the question as to whether public banks or private banks are the way to go. If we start thinking about who should benefit, we might say, well, okay, in my example where one person's cells are actually useful, we still think everyone who contributed should benefit. But in the case of cord blood banking, what if you are not lucky enough to have had a parent who banked your sample? Or what if you think the family should benefit? What if you don't have children, you can't bank their samples? So we're starting to look at a situation where actually even the fact of being able to contribute, to participate in the bank is itself a matter of luck, for which people shouldn't be disadvantaged by being unable to reap the benefits of the cord blood bank. So to me that strongly suggests that we want a distribution of the good, the putative good, and I'll come to that in a moment, that's coming out of the cord blood bank to everybody within society, not just to the people who decided to sign up to the scheme. Okay, cord blood banking raises some particular issues with regard to consent. So another complicating factor is that the harvesting of the sample by definition happens when the direct progenitor, the child who has been born, is not yet capable of giving consent, and the parents make the decision to place the sample into the bank. There's an interesting side point here about who we regard as the progenitor. So there are implications here for genetic rights. Cord blood is what we might consider a sort of liminal biomaterial, so it's harvested at this boundary where the separate embodiment of the gestator and the gestated becomes a reality. And our assumption that the child is the progenitor of the cord blood and not, say, the mother, would be based largely either on genetic identity or on ontology. But I think it gives us some interesting issues to explore around who we consider to be a tissue progenitor in this particular case, and has implications for how we understand the term progenitor in relation to all sorts of other tissue. But without going further into that, is it a problem that the person that we might regard as the progenitor in this case isn't capable of consent? Well, we could say, all right, let's say that a child has a right to withdraw their sample at a later stage. So there's obviously no such thing as a post hoc opt-in. If your cord blood isn't banked at birth, then you're not going to be able to 10 years later turn around and say, I want now to opt into having my cord blood bank. So you might say that a prudent parent would choose to bank their child's cord blood, and then if the child doesn't want to participate later on, they can opt out. Would we want to say that people can withdraw their sample, though? So I said earlier that the right to withdraw is itself ethically contestable. In a case like this, assuming again that cord blood banking is something that's generating benefits, by withdrawing your sample, you're essentially refusing to contribute to that public good. Is that something we want people to be able to do? Particularly in a case where no further interference with bodily integrity is required. Imagine that I own a ladder, and my neighbour, Mr. Jones, comes to me and says, I need your ladder to bridge across the pond because someone has fallen in and is drowning, your classic kind of case of rescue. I don't have a ladder, but can I borrow your ladder? I own a ladder, all I need to do is let him go into my shed and take the ladder and a life will be saved, and I just say, nope, that's my ladder, you're not having it. I think we think that would be pretty morally reprehensible. In a similar sort of way, people's samples are already in the bank, it costs them nothing to let those samples remain. Should they then be able to withdraw? Well, as I say, it might be a morally blamable action to refuse to contribute. Whether we want to make it either legally punishable to refuse to contribute to public goods in that way, or given that participation in cord blood banks is not yet by conscription, whether we want to write that into a governance procedure is another matter. So I imagine parents would be much less likely to enrol their children in cord blood banks if such a condition were in place. This might make us think about how we want to set up the governance structures. But nevertheless, it is a way of conceptualising what people are doing by participating that puts the onus, I suppose, the onus on people saying that you have a right not to do it, to say why should you not contribute to something that's going to be a benefit. Is it?
Can I ask a question?
I've just been given a 2-minute card, so if you can wait 2 minutes, yes you can. Okay. Right, I've been saying a lot of things on the assumption that cord blood banking will in fact provide public benefit. And I think we're all saying, well, hang on, there are a lot of assumptions and conditions that need to be met for that to be the case. So one question I think we want to consider is whether a research result or a therapeutic benefit needs to be guaranteed in order to justify treating the enterprise of cord blood banking as a public benefit. there are questions here philosophically about whether a chance of benefit is an actual benefit. But I will say this, if over time evidence shows that cord blood banking isn't efficient at providing the hoped for benefits, then it's not going to be a good use of resources, but only evidence will tell us that. And our basic assumption on the evidence base we have so far is that there are good scientific and medical reasons to judge it a worthwhile enterprise. So we can't be 100% sure that the benefit will manifest. But what we can say is that there are some factors which, regardless of scientific uncertainty, are liable to pose impediments to the realisation of benefit. And notable among these is the sort of proprietisation that might limit access to knowledge and products. It doesn't mean all commercialisation is bad, and we can have a discussion about what the good reasons and the bad reasons are, but I would say we should proceed with caution in that circumstance. My very last slide is about which publics we're concerned about. So we're all familiar with existing global inequities in healthcare, and I think a question that we need to consider is how coordination of cord blood banking across different jurisdictions at an international level might either make this worse or might be used to address global health and scientific inequity. It's important particularly in cord blood banking because of the infrastructure that's required to participate in cord blood banking scene. So the knowledge, the resources required to set up and maintain and use a cord blood bank, the human resources, the skill base and so forth. Because global scientific equity involves not just access to the end product, but to science at all stages. And so the final point is that if we are to take on board this conception of cord blood banking as a public good and make moral arguments about how we should run cord blood banks on that basis, we need to consider the differing needs of global publics in relation to this. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. I think that you have addressed a lot of questions we would like to think, and because we have 5 speakers today, so
will we defer the questions till afterwards?
Yes, we will.
Okay, sorry.
Sorry, I will have to hold the question for a bit, and so.